Hi everyone, thanks for joining me here on JKD Handmade. For this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to work up this gingham sweater. This is a seamless raglan. We'll begin at the neckline with the ribbing. We'll move down the yoke and down towards the body, finishing off with a ribbing at the bottom edge. You'll work as many rounds as need be to get to the length of the sweater that you require. Just a heads up for this video tutorial, for the bottom ribbing, I did in fact forget to press on the record button and only realized once I was editing the video, but the ribbings are the same. So I will show you how to work the ribbing on the sleeve, and you'll work the bottom ribbing exactly as that of the sleeve. When working the sleeve, we attach yarn to the armhole space and we'll work the sleeve and complete the sleeve with a ribbing. For the materials, you'll need yarn. Now this is the yarn that I used, and to be honest, it doesn't really state on the label what weight this yarn is. I'm just going to assume that it is a DK or category 3 or light worsted weight, because that's what it looks like for me. The recommended hook on this yarn label is a 3mm hook, and I know that category 3s are normally 4mm, but with what it looks like, I'm going by what it looks like, and to me this really looks like a DK weight, so I'm going to use it as if it is a DK weight. To be honest, I don't really understand the numbers listed on this yarn label, so yes, I'm just going with it as a DK weight. You may also use a category 4, which is a worsted weight or RN weights, provided that all 3 of your yarn colors or shades are in the same weight. Like in the case that I'm working with, all 3 of them are these DK weights. So that's really important. So you do need one that is your base color. For me, I'm using the lighter gray, and then I've got the darker grays, as you see, for making up those little squares, and I'm alternating with a white. So these are my 3 colors, and they are all in the same yarn weight. That's really important. Apart from the yarn, you will also need hooks, 2 of them. So I'm using the recommended hook on the yarn label for all my ribbings, which is, I'm going for a 4mm hook for all those ribbings. And then you'll need a hook that is 2 sizes larger for the rest of the sweater. Now really, this is optional. It depends on the tightness of your stitches. You could go 2 sizes larger, or you could even go just 1 size larger, depending on how tight you like your stitches. So remember that going up on the hook sizes gives you a looser stitch. You will also need stitch markers, 4 of them, a pair of scissors. You'll need a measuring tape, and a yarn or a wool needle to seam in all those loose ends. So this pattern may be slightly confusing to understand. I suggest watching the video tutorial first and then decide on whether you understand the concept of working this gingham stitch pattern. Now, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing if you enjoy my video tutorials. Other than that, let's get on with this tutorial. We'll begin with the ribbing at the neckline, and here I'm using my base color, which is this lighter gray. Form a slip knot using the smaller of the 2 hooks, in my case a 4mm hook. Chain 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Into the second chain from the hook, so that's 1 and 2 single crochet. Insert your hook into that chain, pull up a loop. You have 2 loops on your hook. Yarn over, go through 2 loops on your hook. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. At the end of the row, you must have 4 stitches, 1, 2, 3, and 4. With 5 chains that we had initially started off with, we must have 4 stitches. Row 2, chain 1 and turn. Here we're working single crochets. This time we're working single crochets into the back loops only. So the loop that is closest to yourself is your front loop, and the one away from you is your back loop. Into the back loops, work single crochets. So all we're doing for the rest of the ribbing is repeating row 2, which is chain 1, turn, work single crochets into your stitches, work those single crochets into the back loops only. Repeat row 2 until you have a length for your ribbing. I've continued on with my ribbing until I have a long length of ribbing. At this point, you want to take this length of ribbing and measure it around the circumference of the head. Make certain that when measuring, you are not stretching on this ribbing. You measure just as it is. When both ends meet, you know that this ribbing fits around the circumference of the head, as I'm showing you in this image. We now know that the ribbing is able to fit over and down the head. We can now go ahead and count the number of ribbing rounds that we've worked. Now here you'll see that we have ridges along this ribbing, and these are the raised parts of the ribbing. And then in between the raised areas, we have these sunken areas right here. In between the ridges, you have 2 rounds. So that's 2, and then let's look at the next ridge, and here you have 2 rounds, and then it's the next ridge, and so on. So there's always 2 rounds in between those raised areas or ridges. So you count all those ribbing rows that you've worked. It's 2 rows in between the ridges. So then it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on until you've counted all the ribbing rows worked. Once you have the number of rows you've worked, you need to fit those number of rows into the ribbing and size count chart. Here's the ribbing and size count chart. If you do need a hard copy of it, you will find it on my store right here on YouTube. You'll find the link in the description box below. So from this chart, you'll find that the numbers in bold on the left, that is the ribbing number of rows. And then on the right, you'll find those 3 numbers. Those are your separations for a seamless raglan. Now for those numbers in bold on your left, you will need to make certain that your ribbing rows correspond to any of these numbers that I have listed in bold. I've actually worked 2 sweaters. One was for a man size large and the other was for a woman size medium. And for my ribbing rows, I had 88 for the man size large and 72 for the woman size medium. I was short by a few ribbing rows for both of them, and I needed to increase so that the number of ribbing rows that I worked corresponded with that of the chart. You may increase or decrease on the ribbing rows that you've worked so that the number of rows that you worked corresponds with that of the chart. Like in my case, I needed to just increase by 1 or 2 ribbing rows to get it to correspond to the chart. Now that you've adjusted your ribbing rows to correspond to the chart, we'll go ahead and join both these ends to form a ring. Chain 1, bring both those ends together. We will be slip stitching to join both these ends. Insert your hook into the first stitch from one side and then into the stitch from the opposite side and slip stitch. Continue with slip stitches to join the remaining stitches. So for 4 stitches on your ribbing, you must work 4 slip stitches. From this join, you are able to make out the front and the back. You'll see that the little ridge that's formed, that will be the back, and on the opposite side will be the front. We'll now swap out our hook for the larger hook. Round 1 of the yoke, chain 1. Here we're working single crochets into all these ribbing rows all around this edge of the ribbing. Remember, in between those ridges, there are 2 ribbing rows. You'll need to work 1 single crochet per ribbing row. So in between those ridges, you must work 2 single crochets because there are 2 ribbing rows in between those ridges. So if you look at it here, we're working a single crochet into the little gaps along this top edge. So here's the first single crochet. And for the second single crochet into the gap right next to the first single crochet. So in between those ribbing ridges, I have 2 stitches. Then into the next sunken area, I'll work 2 single crochets. That's 1 and 2. Then it's a ridge, and then in between those ridges, it's 2 single crochets. That's 1 and 2. So you'll continue on all around this ribbing edge. I've worked those single crochets all along this edge of the ribbing. Now the number of single crochets that you worked must be the same as the number of ribbing rounds that you've worked. In my case, I worked 88 ribbing rows, or for the women's size, I work 72 ribbing rows. Before you join, make certain that your stitch count is correct. Now to join, into that first single crochet, slip stitch to join. We will now mark off the separations. You will need to use the ribbing and size count chart. Now for the ribbing rows that I worked, which was 72, I marked off the 15th, 37th, and 51st stitch. Start counts as my first corner. Here's the second, and in between it's the sleeve. Then I have the front body, and then it's the sleeve. And right here, from the last stitch marker back to start, it's the back body. Here are the sleeves, and then it's the front and the back body. Now that we have our separations in place, we'll continue on with round 2. Throughout this pattern, we will be working half double crochets. Chain 2, 1, 2, chain 2 counts as our first stitch, turn. Here we're working half double crochets into all stitches until we get to that first stitch marker. Now before moving on, when working a raglan, it is important to know your separations. So we are working now towards the back, as you see here. And then on either of those sides, those are the sleeves, and opposite to the back is the front. Always make certain that you know in which direction you're working, towards the back or towards the sleeve. To work a half double crochet, it's yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, pull up a loop. You've got 3 loops on your hook, yarn over, and go through all those loops on the hook. Continue on with half double crochets into all your stitches until you get to that first stitch marker. I've continued on to that first stitch marker, marking off the corner. Remove the stitch marker. Into that stitch marked off, work a half double crochet. Chain 1, half double crochet, all into that same stitch. We've worked a V stitch, so it's a half double crochet, chain one, half double crochet, all into one stitch. Replace your stitch marker into the chain one space. Now we've just completed the back separation. We will now work the sleeve separation from stitch marker to stitch marker. Continue on with half double crochets into all your stitches until you get to the next corner. I've worked those half double crochets along the sleeve separation to the next corner. Remove your stitch marker. Into the corner, work a half double crochet, chain one, half double crochet, all into that same stitch. Replace your stitch marker into the chain one space. Now here we are at the front of this raglan. As you've seen in the image, there is a stitch pattern to follow. I have calculated those raglan separations in such a way that there's always an odd number of stitches in between your stitch markers. That way you are able to find the exact center front. Now what I did here was I went ahead and eliminated stitches on either side, and that's how I got to my exact center front. Or you could go ahead and count the number of stitches you have in between those two stitch markers and find your center front. Now let's mark out the gingham stitch pattern, which we will be working along the front separation. From the center front, count 2 stitches, 1, 2. Now count in multiples of 5 until you get to that corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it just so happened that I have an exact multiple of 5 to end up with. I will show you in the next clip what to do when you have a remaining portion of stitches at the end. The gingham stitch pattern is worked in multiples of 5 stitches. We will always change our yarn color at the corners. So to be precise, it will always be changed into the second stitch that makes up the corner. Keep in mind that we are working the gingham stitch pattern from the first corner that makes up the front separation to the second corner that makes up the front separation. If you have any stitches remaining, like in my case I don't have any because mine worked to a multiple of 5 right to that corner, then you would watch the next clip. But here I'm changing the color of my yarn into that second stitch from my corner. So I've worked an incomplete half double crochet, and then I'll bring in my change of color to complete the stitch as you see here. Now I will work in multiples of 5, changing my yarn colors in between until I get to the 2 stitches before center front. In this case, I'm working with the second yarn color, which for me it is the white. And as you see, when I work my stitches, I will keep that first yarn color in place so that I'm always sort of working it into the stitches. At the same time, while working, you will keep all your tail ends to the wrong side of the raglan. Work 5 half double crochets using your change of color into the next 5 stitches, 1 half double crochet per stitch. Remember to keep the yarn from your first skein tucked into the stitches as you're working them, as I am doing here. I've worked 2 stitches. This is my third, my fourth, Now once you get to your 5th stitch, you'll work an unfinished half double crochet, leaving 3 loops on the hook. So I've worked my 5 stitches, with the last being an unfinished half double crochet, and then I'll go ahead and pick up on my original color and bring that through to complete the stitch. Now for those of you who, when counting in multiples of 5, as you got to the end you had a remainder of stitches. That means stitches that were less than 5. So it's 4, 3, 2 or 1 remaining. I will explain to you in the next clip on how to continue on with the pattern in that situation. I found that the best way to explain to you is by drawing a diagram. Please excuse my drawing skills. Here I'm drawing the ribbing, and here's the separations, those 4 separations. That's the back, sleeve, sleeve, and the front. Now here I'll only be showing you the front because that's where we're working our stitch pattern. As I explained earlier, you need to find center front. Now I've chosen to work with 17 stitches just to give you an idea. These 17 stitches make up the front separation from stitch marker to stitch marker or from corner to corner. Now I know that it's 17 stitches, so that means my 9th stitch will be center front, because it's 8 plus 8 gives me 16, and then plus 1 gives me 17. So the exact center front is my 9th stitch. Now from center front, I need to count 2 stitches. So here's 1 and 2. And then I need to count in multiples of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So those multiples of 5 make up one set of this gingham stitch pattern, which is in multiples of 5. And then again, I need to count in multiples of 5. But I find that I cannot, because I only have 1 stitch remaining before my corner right here, because I've got 8 stitches on either side of center front. So that 1 stitch, when I change my color, I'll only work the 1 stitch in the change of color, and then I'll change again. I'll work in multiples of 5, and then on the opposite side of my center front, I'll count 2 stitches, and then I'll count in multiples of 5 again, as I'm doing here, and then I'm left with 1 stitch. So on either side of center front, your stitch pattern is going to be the same. And those stitches, those 2 stitches on either side of center front with center front make up 5 stitches. Now those stitches that are remaining on the edges before the corner, those, when I'm changing colors, I'll work 1 stitch in my change of color, and then I'll change my color to work the gingham stitch pattern. And when I get to the corner on the other side of the front separation, I'll change back to my base color and continue on with my stitch pattern, working the sleeve and so on. Let's do this once more using a different stitch count for the front separation. Here's just the front separation with the corner on either side. I'll go with a stitch count of 21 stitches. So my 11th stitch is the center front. And I've got 10 stitches on either side. As I've explained, the first thing is to count 2 stitches. So here's center front, and there's 1 stitch and 2 stitches. And then you're counting in multiples of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These 5 stitches make up 1 stitch pattern. Now here I have 3 stitches remaining. So that's 1, 2, and 3 before the corner. Now, just to explain to you on the opposite side of center front, so we'll count out 2 stitches. You'll see that these 2 stitches on either side of center front, including center front, makes up 5 stitches. And then it's in multiples of 5. That makes up a stitch pattern, and then I have a remaining 3 stitches before the next corner. Here I am making certain that I have the correct number of stitches, which is 21 stitches. Now let's take a look at it from the corner that we're working towards. At this corner, I'll change the color of my yarn, and then I'll work those 3 stitches, those 3 remaining stitches. In my change of color, I'll change again and work in the next color. Here I'm working these multiples of 5. So if I take my colors, it would be white, gray, white, gray, white, and then I'm back at my next corner and I'll change to my base color. So I've started off with my base color and worked all the way around the front separation. And as I change my yarn colors, I form that gingham stitch pattern. And you'll see as we work down the yoke, these remaining stitches, they will increase. That means in the next round, I'll have 4 stitches. And in the next round, I'll have 5 stitches. In the next round, I'll have 6 stitches, and then I can change again. I'll change my yarn colors again. So that means I'll work 1 stitch in a change of color, and then I'll work 5 stitches in my next change of color. So these were just 2 examples to give you an idea of the stitch pattern. The whole idea throughout the stitch pattern is the same. You're always working 5 stitches to form your gingham stitch pattern. You'll have remaining stitches on either side, and those you'll work in your change of color. I'll continue on working 5 half double crochets in this base color. So at all times, we're alternating our yarn colors and we're working 5 half double crochets to complete the stitch pattern. So here goes in my base color, 5 half double crochets into the next 5 stitches. That's 1 half double crochet per stitch, leaving the last stitch unfinished so that I may go ahead and change my yarn colors. Then I'll bring in my change of color to complete that stitch, and here I've worked my 5 half double crochets. Continuing on, I'm 2 stitches before center front. I'll work those 2 half double crochets. So that's 1 and 2. I can now remove the center front stitch marker as I no longer need it. I'll work a stitch into center front, and then I'll work 2 more stitches into the next 2 stitches. Remembering to work the 5th stitch unfinished so that you may go ahead and change yarn colors. Remember, at all times, keep your yarn from the previous color. Keep that towards the edge so that you may work it into the stitch. Now with my change of colors, I'll go ahead and work 5 half double crochets. I will leave the 5th stitch unfinished and go ahead and change my yarn color. And then I'll work the next 5 stitches in the change of color. Okay, so let's take a moment to have a look at this gingham stitch pattern taking shape. So I've got my change of colors. It's the white, gray, white, and so on. And each of the stitch patterns are 5 stitches. So if you have remainders, you'll have your remainder stitches on either side in your change of color. In my case, I didn't really have any remainders, so I've got sets of 5s throughout for this round. You will see in the next round there will be a remaining stitch. Okay, so here I've changed back to my base color, and I'll work the corner into that stitch marked off. So it's a half double crochet, chain 1, half double crochet, worked all into the same stitch. Now notice that I've dropped the second yarn color. So you need to drop your second yarn color at this point, because when you work your next round, you will come back and pick up on that same yarn color. But for now, I will be working the next separation in the base color. Always by drop, I mean set aside that yarn color. Just leave it as be and work only in the base color to the end of the round. And then you'll see when you get to the end of the round, you'll turn, and once you get back to the front separation, you will pick up on that second color. So here I've worked the corner and I've replaced my stitch markers. I've completed the front separation. Take note to leave the second yarn color on the wrong side of this raglan. And here I'm working the sleeve separation in my base color. You work half double crochets into all stitches to the end of the round. I've continued on and completed those half double crochets in the base color. Here I am at the end of the round. Into that same stitch from where we've worked chain 2, work a half double crochet, then chain 1 and slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2 to join. Here we formed the last corner. So it's this corner at start. It's actually the first corner, but we're always completing it right at the end. Round 3, turn, slip stitch into that chain 1 space, chain 2. Chain 2 counts as our first stitch. Take note that we are now working towards the sleeve separation to the next corner. You'll work half double crochets to that next corner. You must remember to work stitches into those half double crochets that make up the corner as well. So you're always working half double crochets into all stitches. I've worked my way to the next corner. Remember again to work stitches into those half double crochets that make up the corners from the previous rounds as well. So here goes that half double crochet, and then I'll work my corner into the chain 1 space, remove the stitch marker. Into that space I'll work a half double crochet, chain 1, half double crochet. Now you'll see you need to follow your stitch pattern. Here I have 1 stitch that is in this base color. So I'll continue on working my stitches in the base color until I get to that point where I change my color to form the gingham stitch pattern. Here I formed this corner. Replace your stitch marker into the chain 1 space. Then I've got 1 stitch to work in my base color before changing yarn. Now round 2 was basically a setup round. It's to set up your stitch pattern for the next round and so on. You will always use your previous rounds as a guide when working the next round and so on. So I've got 1 stitch to work in my base color, and then I need to change colors to get to the next 5 stitches, and then I'll change again to work the next 5 stitches. Here goes this next stitch in the base color. Follow your stitch pattern from the previous round. In my case, at this point, I need to change colors. So I'll complete that stitch in my change of color and I'll go ahead and work the next 5 stitches in my change of color. I'm always following the stitch pattern from the previous round. Here I am at the last stitch from this set of 5 stitches. I'll go ahead and change my yarn, and then I'll work the next 5 stitches in my change of color. Here I am at my last stitch from the stitch pattern. I'll go ahead and change yarn colors. I'll work my next 5 stitches in the change of color. Take note of how I am always following my stitch pattern from the previous round. I'm always changing my colors at that point where there was a change of color from the previous round. You'll complete this front separation in the same way and work your way to the next corner. I've worked my way to the next corner. At this point, I'll go ahead and change yarn. Now, when you get to the corner, it's important that you do drop on that second yarn color. In my case, it's the white yarn, which I'll bring forward because this is the wrong side of my raglan. So you're dropping the second color and you're working only in your base color. Here I am working the corner. At this point, the second color that you drop, you will come back to it in the next round and pick it up so that you can work your stitch pattern along the front separation. But for now, you'll continue on in your base color. You'll work the sleeve separation in your base color, working those half double crochets to the next corner. At the next stitch marker, you'll work a corner and then continue on with half double crochets to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of the round. To complete the round, remember to work a half double crochet into that last stitch, the stitch that makes up the corner from the previous round. Always work your last stitch into that stitch, otherwise you may find that your yoke does not grow. So here I am working that last stitch, then into that chain space where I had worked the chain 2, I'll work a half double crochet, then it's a chain 1, and into the second chain from chain 2, slip stitch to join. Here we've worked the last corner. Round 4, turn, slip stitch into that chain space. Chain 2 counts as a stitch. Half double crochet into all your stitches until you get to the next corner. Into the chain 1 space at the next corner, work a half double crochet, chain 1 half double crochet, then work your way to the next corner. And here at the front separation, you'll follow your stitch pattern with regard to the change of colors. I've worked my way to the front separation. I've completed the corner and I've replaced my stitch marker. I've also made certain to work stitches into those half double crochets from the previous round that make up the corner. I've got a few stitches to go before changing color. I'll work those stitches and I'll change colors as I had shown you in the previous round to complete the front separation. You are always following your stitch pattern from the previous round, and that guides you on when to change your yarn colors to form your gingham stitch pattern. Take notice that those remaining stitches that I had spoken about earlier, they continue to increase with every round worked. When you get to 5 stitches, then you'll work it in a change of color, and again your remaining stitches on the side will be worked in a change of color. So every time you get to 5 stitches, you'll continue to change your colors. But as you go on with these rounds, it would make more sense. I found that I needed to work 3 rounds before I brought in my third color. As you see here, I've only been using 2 colors, and then in my next round I'll bring in my third color. So for my next round I'll work with my base color and the third color. So you decide, you'll work as many rounds as need be with your 2 colors, and then you'll change after those many rounds, you'll change to your third color. So after every 3 rounds, I will be changing my colors, going from using my base color and my second color, worked into 3 rounds, and then for the next 3 rounds it will be my base color and the third color, and that gives me quite a good shape, a shape that I'm happy with. So it's optional, work as many rounds as need be until you're satisfied with the shape that's formed with your rounds, and then you can bring in your third color. So it will be your base color and the third color in the next round. I will continue on with the pattern until I get to the next round, where I will show you how I bring in my third color. I've completed my previous round and I've worked my way to the front separation, where I will be bringing in my third color. Before bringing in your third color, you need to cut off on the second color. That way you're only working with 2 colors for every 3 rounds. Before continuing on, let's have a look at the stitch pattern. For the lighter grays, for the stitch pattern, wherever I worked the lighter grays, I will be working the darker grays, and wherever I had worked the whites, I will be working the 5 stitches in the base color, which is the lighter gray. So for the next 3 rounds, I will be using the darker gray and the lighter gray, alternating between those 2 colors. Now here you will see at this corner, I've already worked the corner, but I will undo this corner. You'll see why in a moment. When working the corner here, these 2 stitches that make up the corner, I need to work 1 stitch in my base color, and then the chain 1 and the next stitch in the change of color. So here goes. The first stitch in the base color, and this stitch I will work unfinished, and then I'll bring in my change of color. Complete your stitch with the change of color. Keep all your tail ends on the wrong side of this raglan. Chain 1, and remember that end of your yarn, hold it in place so that you are always working it into your stitches. Work a half double crochet into that same corner to complete the corner. Here's the completed corner. Replace your stitch marker into the chain 1 space. Then you'll continue on working half double crochets following your stitch pattern. So here I've got 3 half double crochets that I'll work into that lighter gray, keeping my last stitch unfinished. Bring in your change of color to complete the last stitch. Continue on working half double crochets, alternating between those change of colors after every 5 stitches. Here's my 5th stitch, which I'm leaving unfinished. I'll bring in my change of color, which is the darker gray. I'll complete that stitch, and then I'll continue on working 5 stitches in my change of color. So the stitch pattern really is the same throughout for the front section. You will repeat this pattern throughout your front separation for the yoke and for the body. I will speed it up here. You'll see that all I'm doing is repeating what I've already shown you. I've worked my way to the end of this round. So here I've changed the color of my yarn, and I will continue on with my base color because I will need it as I get to my sleeve portion. So I'm always holding that base color in place until I get to my sleeve portion. But here I am working my stitches in my 3rd color, and you'll notice that the number of stitches that I work on this end of the front separation is the same as I had started off the front separation with. So I've worked 3 stitches in the darker gray, and you'll notice that I did start off this front section with 3 stitches. To work the corner, I'll work the 1st stitch in gray, and then I'll complete that stitch in my change of color, which is the base color. Then it's chain 1, and at the same time I'm dropping my 3rd color. I'll leave it to the front separation because when I work back around in my next round, I'll pick up on that 3rd color once again to continue on with my front separation. So continuing on, carrying on with my corner, I've completed my last stitch for that corner, replaced my stitch marker, and then I'll work my stitch pattern as I've been doing all along for my sleeve and my back separation to complete this round. Just to recap, I've left behind my 3rd color so that I may pick it up in the next round at the front separation. And as you see, I'm really happy with the shape that this has formed. 3 rounds of each color has seemed to have done it for me. You can work as many rounds as need be to get to a good enough shape for yourself. Here I am, I'll work my way to that next corner and I'll work along the back separation to complete this round. And then I'll continue on getting back to that front separation and we'll take it from there. I'm back at the front separation. So I've worked that round, I completed it, and then I've started off a new round, and here I am at the front separation. Always keep your ends on the wrong side. Here you'll see that I haven't really with my 3rd color, but I'll just need to improvise and bring it to the wrong side. I've worked my way to the corner. I'll remove my stitch marker. Make certain that you are working your last stitch before the corner into that half double crochet from the previous round that makes up the corner. Okay, so here I am at the chain 1. Into that chain 1 space, half double crochet, leaving that stitch unfinished, pick up on your 3rd color, complete your stitch, chain 1, half double crochet into that same corner, replace your stitch marker into the chain 1 space, and then you're following your stitch pattern. You'll work as you had done in the previous round, working your same colors into those colors from the previous round. So I've got 4 half double crochets that I need to work in my third color. I'll work the 4 half double crochets, leaving the 4th half double crochet unfinished so that I may change my color. So all you're doing here is repeating your stitch pattern, alternating between your 2 colors. I've continued on, and here I am into my next round at the front separation. Now I've worked 2 rounds in this darker gray and light gray combination. You'll see from my previous round that I need to work 3 rounds to get to the shape that I'm looking for. So I've got 1 more round to work in this combination. Here I am at the corner. I'll work that half double crochet into the stitch that makes up the corner from the previous round, and then I'm at that chain 1 space. Remove the stitch marker. Into that chain 1 space, half double crochet, leaving your stitch unfinished. So you need to constantly be aware of your stitches. Now here I'm counting my stitches in the darker gray, and I've got 5 stitches, and it takes 5 stitches to make up a pattern. So for this corner, I'm going to continue on in my base color. So I'm completing that stitch in my base color, and then it's a chain 1, and here into my second half double crochet, I'll leave that unfinished, pick up on my change of color to complete the stitch. That way I know I will be working only 5 stitches in this change of color. You must constantly be aware of the number of stitches you're working, especially after the corners and before your corners at the front separation. You only want to work 5 stitches in your change of colors. I needed to speed this up. We're just repeating the same steps. I will continue on as we get to the end of this front separation. I'm here at the end of the front separation. I'm changing into my third color. So at this point, you need to work the same number of stitches that you had started off with. So it's only 5 stitches that I'll work in my darker gray. That's the third, and here's the 4th, and this is the 5th. At the 5th stitch, I'll work it unfinished, pick up on my base color to complete the stitch. At the same time, I'm leaving behind my darker gray, bring it to the wrong side and leave that behind so that you may pick it up in your next round. Remove your stitch marker, and here I'm working the complete corner in my base color, which is the lighter gray. So it's a half double crochet, chain 1, half double crochet in the base color, replace my stitch marker, and then I'll continue on in the base color to complete this round. I've completed the previous round and I've worked my way back to the front separation. Now here I've worked 3 rounds to complete this shape, which I'm happy with. And You need to keep the number of rounds you work consistent throughout so that the shape that you're forming is always the same throughout the pattern. So for me, it's always 3 rounds that I'm working in my 2 colors. Okay, so you cut off on that tail end after 3 rounds, as you'll be changing to your next 2 colors here. So it would be the grays and the white. And then I'm following the same steps as I did for those first 3 rounds that I had worked in gray and white. Wherever I had worked the darker gray, I will work lighter grays into that stitch, those stitches. And wherever I had worked the lighter grays, I will work whites into those stitches. Take notice of your stitch pattern and follow the same stitch pattern throughout for the front separation. I'll need to bring in white into this corner. As I said, wherever I had worked grays in my previous round, I will be working whites. So here I have a portion of gray and I need to work whites into them, and then I'll alternate with the lighter grays into the darker grays, following my stitch pattern from those first 3 rounds that I had started off with. You'll see after every 3 rounds, you're just repeating the 3 rounds from before. When it comes to your yarn colors, it's either gray or white or light gray and dark gray. Or for that matter, any of the 3 colors that you had chosen to work with. At this corner, I need to bring in my change of color. So I will go ahead and work that first stitch into the chain 1 space at the corner. I'll work that half double crochet unfinished. Bring in my change of color to complete the stitch. And continue on with chain 1. A half double crochet into that chain 1 space so that I can complete my corner. Replace your stitch marker into the chain 1 space, and then you're following your stitch pattern. So it's the next stitch in my change of color, which for me is white. I've just got 1 stitch to work in this change of color. I'll work the stitch unfinished so that I may pick up on my next yarn color to work my next 5 stitches in that color, and so on. You're following the same stitch pattern over and over again. I've worked my way to the end of this front separation. I'm working my last stitch and then I'll work that unfinished, pick up on my change of color. I'll work the 1 stitch in this white as I had done when I started off the front separation. And then into that corner, I'll work a half double crochet. I'll work it unfinished, pick up on my base color, complete the stitch, leave that second color towards the wrong side of the raglan. You will need to pick it up in the next round. Chain 1, half double crochet into that same corner. Replace your stitch marker into the chain 1 space, and then you're continuing on with your stitch pattern in the base color to complete this round. Here are the armhole depth measurements for the different sizes for men and women. Please pause the video to jot down the measurement for the size that you are working on, as you will need this measurement to continue on with the pattern. I've continued on repeating those rounds to complete my stitch pattern. So here's my completed yoke. Work as many rounds as need be to complete your yoke. Fold your yoke in half along the sleeve separation, as I have done here, aligning your edges well. Measure out the armhole depth for the size that you are making. In my case, for this pattern here, I'm working a man size large, which would be 9.5 inches. And I also did work a woman size medium, which was 7.5 inches. Follow the chart that I had given you with regard to the armhole depth measurements. The chart does state measurements in both inches and centimeters. I always prefer going for the measurement that is slightly smaller. As you'll see, there's 2 measurements listed under every size. A smaller measurement will give you a closer fit, and the larger measurement will give you a slightly looser fit, but the difference isn't that big at all. Once you have the armhole depth measurement measured out for the size that you are working, we will now continue on with the body from where we had stopped. There are 2 options when working round 1 of the body. It all depends on which way you are turning. You're either turning towards the back body or towards the sleeve. I will be turning towards the back body, but I will show you what to do in case you are turning towards the sleeve. Turn. So you will slip stitch into that chain 1 space, and then it's chain 2. Chain 2 will count as your first stitch. Chain a further 3. That's 1, 2, 3. This chain 3 counts as a joining chain. So in total, we have a chain 5. The chain 3 is optional. You may chain more chains, keeping in mind the longer the chain, the looser the fit on the body and the sleeves. Do remember that the chain 2 counted as a stitch, which is your half double crochet, and your chain 3 is the joining chain. Now skip the stitches in between. These stitches make up the sleeve separation, and join into the corner that chain 1 space with a half double crochet. So we've worked our way to the front separation. At this point, you will need to follow your stitch pattern to work up this gingham stitch. Count your stitches and follow the same color scheme as you did, working 3 rounds of each of those color changes. So here I am, I needed to open up on my last stitch because I needed to bring in my change of color. Working the front body will be the same as you did when working the yoke. Continue along the front separation to the next stitch marker at the corner. Here on out, I'll explain what needs to be done. At that corner, you will chain 3, the same number of chains as you did on the opposite corner. So it was a chain 3. That joining chain will be the same. And then you will continue on by skipping the stitches in between. These stitches make up the second sleeve and join to the next corner with a half double crochet into that chain 1 space. Then you'll work half double crochets along the back body, and when you get to the end, you can slip stitch into the second chain from that chain 5. So you slip stitching into the second chain because the second chain, those 2 chains make up the 1 stitch. Okay, let me undo what I've done and continue on from where I had stopped. I will be working towards the back body. Turn. As you see, I'm working towards the back body. Continuing on, chain 2. Chain 2 counts as our first stitch, and here you're working half double crochets into all stitches to the next stitch marker. I've worked my way along the back body to the next stitch marker. Half double crochet into that corner. Then it's chain 3. 1, 2, 3. Chain 3 is our joining chain. Again, this chain is optional. You may chain a much longer chain, keeping in mind that the longer the chain, the looser the fit of the body and the sleeves. Skip the stitches in between. These stitches make up the sleeve separation, and join to the next stitch marker with a half double crochet into that chain 1 space. Here we have formed the first armhole space. We are now working along the front body. So here you need to follow the stitch pattern as you did for the yoke. You will change your colors after every 5 stitches as we did with the yoke. The stitch pattern is the same. I will speed up this portion as I've already explained this when working the yoke. I've worked my stitch pattern along the front body, and here I am at the next stitch marker. We formed the first armhole space, and now we will be forming the second armhole space. Half double crochet into that chain 1 space. Remember, you're changing the color of your yarn, keeping your stitch pattern the same as you did when working the yoke. So I needed to work 2 more stitches to get into that chain 1 space. Then it's chain 3. You'll chain the same number of chains as you did when chaining your joining chain for the first armhole space. Then skip the stitches in between. These stitches make up the second sleeve, and slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2. That stitch that we had started off with. The chain 2 that counted as a stitch right at the very start. Slip stitch into the second chain. We have now formed the second armhole space. Continuing on with round 2 of the body. Here we're working half double crochets throughout. So it's chain 2, turn, work half double crochets into your chains, your joining chains, and then when you get to the front of your sweater, you'll continue on with your gingham stitch pattern, and along the back you'll work half double crochets. When you get to the end, you can slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2 to join. I've continued on with the body of the sweater. For the lady size that I made, I did crop the sweater, so you'll work as many rounds as need be to get to the length that you're looking for. We'll now work the ribbing at the bottom of the sweater. You'll swap out your larger hook for the smaller hook. Chain 11. Now this chain 11 is again optional. You can chain as many chains as you like. depending on how long or short you'd like your ribbing. I go for a chain of 11 for adult sizes. That's what I generally go for. If you want a shorter ribbing, you'd go for maybe 9 or 7 or whatever it may be. Now, I did only realize when editing that I didn't press record when working the rest of the ribbing here. So I will edit in the clips that I had taken when working the ribbing from the sleeve. The sleeve ribbings and this bottom ribbing is exactly the same. Round 1, into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. If you have worked 11 chains as I did, you should have 10 stitches. It's always 1 stitch less than the number of chains you had chained when working single crochets. We now need to join this portion of the ribbing to the bottom edge of the sweater or sleeve. So here I'll work a slip stitch at that bottom edge. And here's a second slip stitch into the bottom edge. As I'm explaining the ribbing for both the sleeve and the sweater, when you do work the ribbing for the sleeve, if your sleeve is rather wide and you choose to tighten up even more on the ribbing, you can even work 3 slip stitches instead of 2. That way you will tighten up on your ribbing even more. Round 2, turn. Skip those slip stitches. So I've worked 2 slip stitches. I'll skip the next 2 stitches. That's 1 and 2. And I'll work my stitch into that next stitch. That's where I'll begin my ribbing. Single crochet into the next stitch, single crochet into the back loops only. So your back loop is the loop that is further away from yourself, and the front loop is the loop that is closer to yourself. Continue on to the end of the round. I've continued on to complete row 2 of the ribbing. Always make certain that your stitch count remains the same. Row 3, chain 1 and turn. Chain 1 counts as the turning chain. Into the first stitch, single crochet. Continue on with single crochets into the back loops only. I've worked my way to the end of the row. Now I need to join the ribbing edge to the bottom edge. To do so, I'll work 2 slip stitches. So here's the first slip stitch and that's the second. Then turn, skip those slip stitches, 1, 2, and continue on working single crochets into the back loops only to the end of the row. You will repeat row 2 and row 3 all around the bottom edge of your sweater and sleeve. I've worked my ribbing all around the sleeve edge, as you see here. You'll know that you're done when all your stitches at the bottom edge are used up and the ribbing edges meet. We'll now slip stitch to join both these ends. Insert your hook into the stitch on one side of the ribbing. Insert your hook into the stitch on the opposite side of the ribbing and slip stitch to join. Continue with slip stitches to join the remaining stitches along your ribbing edges. I've continued on and slip stitched to join my ribbing edges. At this point, I can fasten off and cut off on the excess yarn. So I've shown you how to work the ribbing for both the sleeve and the bottom edge. The ribbings will be worked in exactly the same way. Now that we've completed the body of this raglan, let's move on to the sleeve. Here we need to attach yarn to the underarm at the armhole space. Chain 2. Chain 2 counts as our first stitch. Here we're working half double crochets into all stitches all around this armhole space. You can remove all your stitch markers, you no longer need them. Continue on with half double crochets to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of round 1 for the sleeve. To complete the round, slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2 to join. Round 2, chain 2 and turn. Chain 2 counts as our first stitch. Continue with half double crochets all around the armhole space. When you get to the end, slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2 to join. You can now repeat round 2 for the rest of the sleeve for as long as you'd like your sleeve, or if you want to taper off on the sleeve, you will work your sleeve until the elbow, and then I'll show you how to work decreases to taper off on the sleeve. I've continued on with the sleeve. I've repeated round 2. I've worked the sleeve until it reaches the elbow. And from the elbow downwards, I'd like to taper off on the sleeve. If you wish to leave your sleeve with the same width throughout, you may continue to the full length of the sleeve. But if you plan on tapering off on the sleeve, do stop at the elbow, and thereafter we'll work decreases. I've stopped at the elbow. I'll continue on from there, and I'll work decreases to taper off on this sleeve. Chain 2, 1, 2, and turn. When I work decreases for my sleeve, I always work those decreases on either side of chain 2. Now for the first decrease, yarn over, insert your hook into the first stitch, pull up a loop, insert your hook into the next stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, and go through all those loops on your hook. That was the first decrease for this round. Continue on with half double crochets until you get to the last 2 stitches. I've worked my way to the end of this decrease round. Here I've got 2 stitches to go. Into those 2 stitches, I'll work the second decrease. So it's yarn over, insert your hook into the first stitch, pull up a loop. You've got 3 loops on your hook. Insert your hook into the last stitch, pull up a loop. You've got 4 loops on your hook. Yarn over and go through all those loops on the hook. To end the round, slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2. For the next round, chain 2 counts as a stitch, turn, work half double crochets into all stitches. At the end of the round, slip stitch into the second chain to join. After every 3 rounds, you will work a decrease round for the rest of the sleeve, and in that way you will taper off on the sleeve. Work your sleeve to the length that you want it at. I've continued on with my sleeve. Here you see that it does taper off as we get to the bottom of the sleeve. We can now, once we've got the length correct, we'll work the ribbing. The ribbing is just as I had shown you earlier on when working the bottom of the sweater. You'll swap out your hook for the smaller hook and continue on with your ribbing. Repeat the same steps to work the second sleeve. Now that all that's left to do is to weave in all these ends. Using your yarn needle, weave these tail ends into the wrong side of the sweater. You'll work into the stitches on the wrong side, back and forth to lose those ends. Repeat for all the tail ends, and that does it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed it.